Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. How are you? Thank you. I haven't even done anything. I'm Michael Barker. I'm the managing director of Westport Country Playhouse, and I am pleased to introduce you to this afternoon's very special program, A Conversation with Lynn Nottage. I first have the great privilege to acknowledge two important people who made this possible. The first is Anya Chekai-Farber, who is not only a sponsor of our production of MLIMA'S Tale with Barbara Samuelson, but she's also sponsoring today's event. So let's give her a round of applause. I think she's right there. I also want to give a shout out to Harold Bailey. Harold is, like Anya, a trustee of the Playhouse, and it was he who originally put us in touch with Lynn so we could arrange this conversation. So thanks to him. This event, this conversation, is an opportunity for all of you to gain some insight and understanding about Lynn's background, her work, and specifically this powerful play, MLIMA'S Tale. It will provide useful context when you attend the Playhouse's production, which begins this Tuesday, October 1st, and runs through October 19th. The box office will be open after this afternoon's event, for those of you who have not yet purchased your tickets. All right? We'll lock the doors on the way out. In conversation with our wonderful guest is our very own artistic director and my producing partner, Mark Lamos. Mark has a long and rich history in the American theater, including leading Hartford Stage for 16 seasons, where he won the 1989 Regional Theater Tony Award. Some of his Broadway credits include Our Country's Good and Seascape, both garnering Tony nominations. In addition to being a widely acclaimed director of classical theater, he has also been a champion for new work. Some of his past collaborators include, but are not limited to, Arthur Miller, Tony Kushner, Edward Albee, A.R. Gurney, and the composer Tanya Leone. Speaking to Mark this evening is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning dramatist and one of the most important voices of the American theater of this and the last century. Her plays have been produced all over the United States and throughout the world. Some of her most notable works are Sweat, for which she won the 2017 Pulitzer and Obie and received a Tony nomination, Ruined, which won the 2009 Pulitzer, Intimate Apparel, which the Playhouse produced on this stage in 2014, MLIMA'S Tale, which premiered at the Public Theater in 2018, tickets on sale at the Playhouse box office, and many, many more. In 2007, she was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant, and this year she received a spot on Time 100's list of most influential people for all of her contributions to the art form and powerful depictions of life in America and throughout the world. We are pleased to welcome this distinguished playwright to our theater in the form of her plays, and now in person. Please join me in welcoming Mark Lamos in conversation with Lynn Nottage.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's a great pleasure for us to have Miss Nottage with us. So let's get right to it.
Sure. Can you hear me? Is this a good place for the mic?
That's good.
Okay, great.
You were born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn?
I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn, and I actually still live in the house that I grew up in, so it's a kind of perfect... I said I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn, and I now live in the house that I grew up in, so it was a perfect circle. If I was a hometown girl, I would not have left home.
So, as a kid in Brooklyn, did you get a chance to see a lot of theater?
I did. I was very fortunate when I was growing up to have parents that felt that art was an essential part of nurturing a young mind. Not only did I go to see a lot of theater, I went to museums, and it was also a very rich moment, particularly in African American theater when I was growing up. There was a Negro Ensemble, the New Federal Theater, and being from Brooklyn, I often went to a very small community theater called the Billie Holiday Theater, which subsequently did some of my work. And so I think that just being in proximity to theater is part of why I was drawn to this particular medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Negro Ensemble Company did some amazing work.
Amazing things. You know, I was very fortunate to have seen the original production of Soldier's Play and Zoom and the Sign by playwright Charles Fuller, who before August Wilson was working on a history cycle.
Oh, yeah, right. It's terrible that theater no longer exists, I think. I wish it were there. When I was at Hartford Stage, we brought them in we brought the company to the theater with a commission by Derek Walcott, the Caribbean poet.
Yeah.
And Douglas Turner Ward was starring in it and directing it, so it was a big deal. But I loved being with them and knowing them.
Yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful theater.
Yeah, yeah. How would you describe your childhood?
How would I describe my childhood?
Not an easy question.
Yeah, that's not a question that I often get asked a lot. I would say that in some ways I had a wonderful childhood. It was not without some of the bumps that most childhoods have. I had two very loving parents who nurtured me and my brother. I grew up in a neighborhood which is Boerum Hill, Brooklyn, which at the time when I was growing up would consider to be quite a tough neighborhood. But for many of us who were there at the time, we didn't know that.
Yeah.
You know, for us it was kind of this magical neighborhood. And just anecdotally, our house was robbed 8 times, and the final time, I remember my mother sort of shaking her hands and saying, "Oh my God, we have to go out and get a television because God forbid there's not a television here when they come the next time." But that's the neighborhood we grew up in, and we took that for granted. But one of the other lovely things about the neighborhood is that it was a nexus neighborhood. I describe it as the neighborhood between neighborhoods, that people who were passing on to other neighborhoods, they always had to drive through ours. And so as a result, many people who were marginalized by other places found comfort in what was Gowanus and Boerum Hill. And so it was multicultural. It was economically diverse. It was many things that most of New York wasn't in that moment. And I think a lot of that really fed my creativity and the creativity of some of the other people on the block. I grew up a few doors down from novelist Jonathan Lethem, who famously wrote a book called The Fortress of Solitude, which is about our block.
Wow. I love that book, yeah.
Yeah. And so many people that I grew up with in that book, including my brother. For whatever reason, I didn't make the book. Which remains, me and Jonathan's sister were like...
Have you talked to him about
Yes,
that?
we did. Because when he first wrote it, he gave me the galleys, and I was reading through, I'm like, uh-huh. And then at the very end, I'm like, but where...
Your father was a social worker?
My father was a social worker, and my mother was a school teacher. And my father, when he was growing up, ended up having a very bad accident. He broke his back and was paralyzed for a number of years throughout my childhood, and he stopped working. And I think that for me that was a defining moment, because we were doing very well, and then suddenly this happened. And my mother, who was a school teacher, found herself burdened with not only taking care of 2 children on what was a very small salary, but also my father.
Yeah, wow. But then he got better?
He did get better. He had some surgery that was revolutionary at the time, which is probably now standard, which permitted him to move again and walk and to re-enter his life.
Wonderful, wow. So early in your life, theater was a part of it.
Yes.
But you really were looking at becoming involved in medicine, right?
Yes and no. I went to high school. I went to the High School of Music and Art, which is now LaGuardia High School for music. Is there a LaGuardia person? Woo!
Right.
Yes. And I was studying music, and I was just very interested in writing and the arts, but I also happened to be very good at mathematics. And when I graduated from high school, I was really tracked into sort of that STEM, what's called STEM now, and I got a scholarship to go to Brown University specifically to be a doctor. And 2 years in, I found myself taking all these science courses that didn't make me super happy, and it wasn't my track, and I took a deviation, which was to go into creative writing and American literature. And so it's like, yes, I was pre-med, but I never wanted to be a doctor.
Interesting, wow. So you sort of matriculated there because you had those talents.
Well, I had these talents, yeah, and I was identified, and I was kind of pushed in that direction. I was very fortunate to get a scholarship, and you can't say no when someone's willing to help subsidize your education.
Yeah, yeah. Did you like Brown?
I did. I liked it very much, and I was very fortunate to have some outstanding teachers who in many ways shaped who I am as a playwright. I worked in particular with a gentleman, a professor named George Bass, who ran Rights and Reasons Theater, which was the African-American theater that was connected to Brown University because it was right on the campus. And he from very beginning, was instrumental in helping me find my voice and helping me really lean into playwriting. And then the other person who I studied with was Paula Vogel in my senior year, and many people might know Paula Vogel, who's a playwright, and she happened to be the very first woman who I'd met who wrote plays. And I was in school at a time where we just didn't read plays written by women, and I didn't even know that it was a career that women could go into. Up until that point, I thought that playwriting was a hobby, that's something that I was going to do, and then I'd have to figure out when I graduate how I was going to make money. Mm-hmm. And Paula pushed me to apply to the Yale School of Drama, which is something that I was not going to do. And I got in, and the rest is, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Who was in charge of the program at Yale when you were there?
When I was there, Lloyd Richards was the dean of the program, and Oscar Brownstein was the head chairman of the playwriting department.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lloyd had a big influence on me when I was in Hartford because he was running Yale.
He was running Yale, and he also ran the O'Neill for a very long time, so he had very deep roots in Connecticut.
Yeah. It was just sort of he wasn't a mentor, but it was like somebody you could turn to as a young artistic director and say, Lloyd, what am I doing wrong here, or what am I doing right? And he was able to sort of pinpoint things that in the simplest possible way. He had this great economy of...
He sure did. He could communicate with very few words. And he was just so smart and efficient with his critiques.
Yeah. There's a famous story, I don't know if you've heard this, or maybe it's apocryphal, but that he was working on the first August Wilson collaboration, which I think was Fences, at the O'Neill, which I saw. It was like 5 hours long. And the story is that he said to August one night, you know what has to go. So tomorrow, you know what has to go, and I know what has to go. So tomorrow, bring it in with those things gone. And he didn't have any idea what should go.
But it's funny because I was at Yale during the time when Lloyd was nurturing August Wilson's work, and I had the opportunity to work on piano lesson as a dresser. And I still remember the very first preview. There wasn't a curtain, but the play ended, and the audience was half empty because the play was 5.5 hours. I mean, those of us working backstage were happy because we got overtime. But it was kind of miraculous to watch the way in which August Wilson then whittled down that play, probably to 4 hours when it left Yale Rep, and by the time it hit Broadway, it was probably a lean 2.5, 3 hours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you pinpoint what you maybe learned from being around August and being around his work when you were young?
It's interesting you asked that question because at the time I was at Yale, it was very difficult because it was such a male-centric place. And I certainly learned many lessons from August Wilson just watching his process and, listening to his words over and over again when I was sitting backstage. But a lot of people say, well, did they nurture you? Were they there for you? And I almost hesitate saying this, but they were not. Mm-hmm. As a woman, I felt that I was not really part of whatever that fraternity they had. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so what I learned, I guess the greatest lesson is to sort of lean into my own voice and to find the people who are going to nurture and support my work and create my own community. Mm-hmm. And I think that if I hadn't been someone looking from the outside in, I probably wouldn't have had the gumption or the tenacity to do that.
When was your work first produced at Yale? Was it after you had graduated?
Yeah, it was long after I had graduated.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Who are the playwrights you most admire, or the writers you most admire
Oh,
that aren't even writing for the,
My
theater?
my goodness! I think that the writers that really shaped my sensibilities and taught me to love words were African American writers who were writing in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Louise Merriweather and Alice Childress and Rosa Guy and Paul Marshall. I mean, those are the books that I consumed as a child, and those books had images of girls and women who were familiar to me and the stories that I just leaned into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you ever try to sort of recreate that feeling in your plays?
You know, I think that that's part of my DNA. I don't think I consciously try and recreate it. I do remember when I was a young writer being very self-conscious because so many of those books that I read took place in the South. And I grew up in New York, and I'm a fourth-generation New Yorker. And when I was reading those books, I had never even been South. And so I self-consciously tried to conjure those voices when I was young. But I very quickly realized that I'm this urban girl, and there's no way that I can replicate those voices, that I have to find my own vocabulary.
Yeah. Have you written Southern characters?
Have I written Southern characters?
Let me
I did, in Crumbs from a Table of Joy.
Yeah.
I wrote characters who migrate from the South during the Great Migration to the North and settle in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the play is really about these Southern folk trying to negotiate this new space and feeling very marginalized.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful play.
Thank you.
Speaking of what you write, I think one of the things that amazes me and amazes so many people about your extraordinary output of work is how amazingly different every play is. When we do extensive season planning meetings here that last all season, you know, what will we do in the next season? And when we started talking about, when I read MLIMA'S Tale, I just fell so in love with it, I wanted to do it. And someone on the staff said, yes, but we just did one of Lynn's plays. We did Intimate Apparel about 3 seasons ago. And someone else said, yes, but her plays are so different, we could do a different one every season. It wouldn't be like doing a Gurney play or a Miller play, you know.
It's very different.
It's astonishing. Do you do a lot of research
I
to
do.
take you to different places?
Yeah, I do a lot of research, and I think I have this very nomadic imagination. Even as a child, I was someone that I kind of describe it because I backpacked a lot when I was young, and I was always looking for that beach that no one had ever been to. You know, it's like I'd take a bus for an extra 10 hours just to touch that sand. and I think that has filtered down into the way in which I write, is that I'm always looking for a space or an idea that hasn't been explored on the stage. I would say because I get restless very, very easily, that I'm not interested in replicating what I did in the past. And it's even hard for me to go back and look at some of my old work because
Sure.
I just want to continue moving forward and finding something new and finding something different.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, every one of them seems so new somehow and so fresh. How did you get towards Ruined, the first play?
I guess to explain how I got through to Ruined, I talk about how I got to Intimate Apparel,
Good.
which I really consider my breakthrough play because it's a play that I wrote differently from other work that I had written in the past, and I think it's less mimetic than some of the other work. I wrote it after my mother died. I very specifically wanted to write something that she would love. I wrote the play also from a space in my heart that was unfamiliar and very emotional, and when I completed that play, I was very excited that I could actually go someplace that felt very honest and raw and authentic to my imagination. But to write that play, I had to do a lot of research. The play, which is set in 1904 New York City, which is inspired by my great-grandmother, who I never knew and didn't have any information about, required that I go into the New York Republic Library and spend about a year trying to piece together what was New York like for an African-American woman in 1904. When I tried to find books written about that, they didn't exist. And so my research really became primary research, trying to piece together what was a day in the life of a woman like Esther Armstrong. And after I completed Intimate Apparel, I was really excited by that process, and I began, some 7 years later, Ruined, which took me even further and deeper into the process of research. And the way that Ruined came about is I was working with a longtime collaborator named Kate Worski, and we were very interested in doing this modern adaptation of Mother Courage. And we wanted to set in the Congo, because at that moment, which was, when did we begin the research? I think it was in 2004, there was a massive war that was going on in the center of the African conflict, which was a war that today is the largest conflict since World War II. But I still couldn't find that much information in any periodicals. And so I said to Kate, let's just go to East Africa and do the research ourselves. And she had a travel grant, I had conjured some money, and we found ourselves on a plane going to East Africa and going to the border and interviewing Congolese women who were fleeing that armed conflict. And it was devastating, it was difficult, it reshaped the way I wanted to tell the story, so I abandoned telling the tale of Mother Courage and found a uniquely African story which became Ruined. But after that initial trip, I felt I still didn't have enough information. I applied for a Guggenheim grant, got that grant, went back and spent even more time in East Africa. That still wasn't enough because I thought, I don't know how to write this play. And finally, I think that the final piece for me was going on a retreat with playwright Eric Ain, who had put together he put together a trip for artists who were looking at the way in which they could use art as a tool for healing. And the trip specifically was to Rwanda. And so a group of us went there, and not only to talk to people who were genocide survivors, but to figure out as artists what we could do to help them heal and others heal who've been through trauma. And so, I mean, that's the journey for Ruined, and it unlocked something in me that was very, very exciting just creatively, because I realized that the research was not separate from the writing of the play, and the research was not simply procrastination, but it was the fuel that I needed to inspire me to put those words down, and I subsequently wrote Sweat in a very similar way.
Can you talk about how that came about?
Sure. A Sweat, which...
From the Congo to Reading, Pennsylvania.
Reading to Pennsylvania.
Another.
Well, Sweat came about, I was actually in Chad doing a production of Ruined, which was immensely exciting. I came home and was very tired. I clicked on my email, and in my inbox was an email from a very close friend of mine who lived 2 doors down, and she was a mother of 2, and she was completely broke, but she'd written this email just saying, I see everyone on a regular basis, I'm always smiling, but I want to let you know that I'm in trouble. I have no money, I have been struggling, and I don't know what to do. I'm not asking for anything other than I want to share my situation with my closest friends. And it actually, the email made me cry because I realized I do see her on a regular basis, and I had no idea that she was struggling in the way in which she was. And so the next day I called her up, and I said, let's go to Occupy Wall Street, which was literally beginning that week. We didn't know what it was, but we felt like we needed to be in a space with other people who were struggling, who were frustrated, who were angry. And we spent literally like a week walking around Zuccotti Park and marching and protesting. And at the end of that week, she said she actually felt a little better, even though her circumstances hadn't changed, but I felt like I needed more information. I needed to understand literally why someone like Jean, who was solidly middle class, you know, who had done all the right things, could find herself completely broke and without any options. And so I set out to find out what was happening to Americans and how the American dream had been corrupted. And I looked very intentionally for a city that had once been an industrial powerhouse, a city that was in the Northeast, a city that was a microcosm of what was happening in America, and also a city that was in driving distance from New York, which was essential. Which is really funny because at the time when I began going to Reading, Pennsylvania, I didn't drive, and so I hired an assistant who was going to help me with my interviews. And when we went to rent a car, I discovered he didn't drive, and so I had to hire a third person. And it ended up being quite fortuitous because there were always three of us that would travel down to Reading, Pennsylvania, which meant that we could cover more space and we could interview more people. But in Reading, our assumption was that we'd be there for 2 weeks, that we'd do these in-depth interviews, and I'd go home and write. And I ended up being in Reading for 2 years. And forging a really deep relationship with that city because there was so much to uncover. And I also forged relationships with people, and I felt like I can't abandon them. And so I wrote Sweat, and then after Sweat, I built this massive performance installation in Reading, Pennsylvania. One, to say thank you to the city, and also to bring a city that was woefully divided across economic and racial lines together. I wanted to create a space, as I described, where the mayor of the city and a homeless person could sit next to each other and both recognize that they shared the same narrative. And I have to say, this happened. That they're actually, and it remains the thing I'm most proud of, is there was an evening when not the current mayor, but the former mayor was there, and he was literally sitting next to a homeless guy, and it was incredibly moving.
Wow, that's amazing. Are the characters in Sweat really people you met there, or
they're composites?
Yeah.
The characters are composites, and some are more inspired by people that I encountered than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are some of the stories in Sweat true, or?
Yeah, some of the stories in Sweat are indeed true.
Did you have an aesthetic? Were you looking to write a play in a certain mode when you wrote Sweat, or did Sweat just kind of develop itself, out of you?
Usually I do have an organizing principle when I'm writing a play, which most people don't know, but it's the way in which I organize. Like Sweat, for instance, what I knew is that I wanted every scene to be about a different character, and that within each scene, every character would have an aria in which they sung their truth. And so that was the organizing principle of Sweat.
Wow. Well, that happened.
Well,
that sure happened, yeah.
And that's how it progressed. I thought, okay, now this is Cynthia's scene, this is Tracy's scene, this is Oscar's scene. And
it's been performed in Reading, right?
It has.
What was that like?
Well, right after we produced the play at the Public, we drove down the next morning at 7 a.m. and we performed the play free for about an audience of 250 people in Reading, Pennsylvania. And always part of the mission statement when we wrote the play was to make it accessible. Even where it premiered at Oregon Shakespeare, we brought in folks from unions for free to see the play. And when we were on Broadway, a lot of us, including the actors, every single week gave up part of their salary so that we could bring people into the theater to see it, because it was really important to us that that the theater that people who couldn't afford to come to the theater not be afraid to cross that threshold because they couldn't afford it. So we made it accessible. And after we did this wonderful reading of the play in Reading, which was kind of astonishing, because after sitting for 2.5 hours listening, people then stood up and testified and shared their stories, and it was very, very emotional. And we realized that there was an opportunity to do this on a larger scale. And so the following year, we decided that we were going to do the very first public theater mobile tour of the Rust Belt. And so we went to 17 theaters and provided free theater, and then afterwards we had conversations just about the economy and about what people were going through emotionally.
Who funded that?
It was funded by many different people. Initially, we'd written a grant at Oregon Shakespeare Festival to fund us going to Reading, and you know what, I can't tell you who was the major funder,
Wow, yeah.
but it was a massive undertaking.
Wow, yeah, huge. How fabulous.
Yeah.
That's great. I'd love to talk about, you just had a play open at the Guthrie called
Yes.
Floyd's.
Floyd's.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure, Floyd's is it's funny. I just felt in this moment, what can I write and place on the stage that makes people feel good? What can I write that's mindful? What can I write that is sort of a celebration of the diversity of America? And so I wrote Floyd's, which is a play about mindfulness. And it takes place in a sandwich shop where three ex-cons just basically are making sandwiches, and the sandwich shop is run by the devil. And they're just trying to get out.
Is it playing now?
It's not playing now. It will play next year, but it is very, very funny. And all of us just, it's rare that you get to make a piece of theater that every single person involved just loves coming to work every single day, including the designers who usually show up for a couple hours and disappear. But our designers would not leave.
That's great.
Which I felt like was a huge accomplishment.
We are now on the set of MLIMA'S TALE. This is going to be, I guess, the second production.
The second production, which is
so
super exciting.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about second productions? I heard a podcast with you in which you talked about the fact that you thought Ruined would be done much more by theaters around the country,
Right.
and that especially after it won the Pulitzer and all of this attention, and then it hasn't been.
No, it hasn't. I mean,
how important are second productions?
well, I think number one, second productions are the lifeblood of playwrights, and often you really don't find what the play is until that second or third production. It certainly, in the case of Ruined, was produced first at the Goodman Theater in Chicago, and it was in New York that we really found our production. And so it was super important that we got to see it in front of an audience. There were things that cut out, there were songs, there were things that didn't work. And in that second production, I had some distance, and I was able to look at what was wrong without feeling overly self-conscious or precious about it.
MLIMA'S TALE is about the ivory trade, among other things, from Africa to China. It's about a lot of things. It's been just thrilling to work on, and still is thrilling to work on, I have to say. And I guess you got the idea from Catherine Bigelow, or Catherine Bigelow sort of suggested this to you?
Yeah, director Catherine Bigelow. I don't know whether you know Catherine Bigelow.
Hurt Locker.
She'd come to me and she said, I'm so profoundly upset about what's going on with elephants, and I want to do something immediately, and I want to do something that's visceral, and that's something that's going to move audiences. And she's a filmmaker, and she'd never done a play. And we began talking about it, and I said, let's make a piece of theater. And she sent me just reams and reams of research, and in particular an article by Damon Tambor, who is a journalist, called The Ivory Highway. And that sparked my interest, because it really is about the journey of a tusk from an elephant to the marketplace. And it traces all of the hands that touch that piece of ivory before it ends up as this shiny, bright thing in a glass case in China. And I thought, how do I take that story and put it on stage? And that's how MLIMA'S TALE came about. But then I began doing research and discovering just how smart and beautiful elephants are. And I thought, I have to put the elephant on the stage, because it's not just about the ivory, it's really about a soul, this beautiful soul that's been commodified, and that's rare. And at the time we began working on the play, elephants were very, very much in jeopardy. I think there was one statistic that said if the ivory trade wasn't stopped, within 25 years, elephants would be extinct. And that was not hyperbole at the moment. Since the play was produced, thankfully, China has stopped the import of ivory and the sale of ivory. unless it's which, and this is the caveat, unless it's antique. But as we know, it's very easy to age ivory and to forge papers. But since many of these countries have ceased the ivory trade and ivory sale, we see that the elephant populations are beginning to come back. They're still very much endangered, but at the moment we felt like it was, it's like climate change. Like, this is the moment. If we don't do anything right now, there is no going back. And in fact, and this is a real statistic, if you come and see the play, it's about a big tusker. And right now in Africa, there are only 25 big tuskers left. And most of them are in Kenya. And those elephants are in jeopardy because they have these large, immensely beautiful tusks that are greatly valued.
Yeah, yeah. It's extraordinary in the play you write. It's played by 4 actors, one of whom plays Lima, and then he plays the tusk and really the spirit of the elephant.
The spirit who haunts everyone who touches him.
Yeah, and implicates everybody who touches.
Yeah, he becomes a ghost that haunts.
I was so intrigued by the play, partially because I share the very personal feelings about the tragedy of these animals, but also what it says about globalization and how, and also it's made me rethink about, just personally, about the soul of things. You start to, yes, he's in the ivory, but you look at like the David, and then you look at the Michelangelo slaves in stone, and you think that.
Well, it's everything. When I was working on Ruined, it made me hyper aware of the fact that this war is raging because of coltan, which is this very conductive metal that's only produced in Congo and Poland, and it's used to generate our cell phones and our computers. And so inadvertently, all of us were complicit in this war unwittingly. And I do think we have to, and that's in part why I wrote a play about mindfulness, is that I think we have to be much more mindful and intentional in the way in which we think about our world, think about how we consume, how we move on a day-to-day basis through life.
That's wonderful. I agree. Lynn Nottage, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bravo.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.